Hi, everyone, and welcome to the PGCMLS Horror Readers Advisory. My name is Joy, and I work at the Bowie branch, and I'm here with...
I'm Sarah, and I work at the Spaldings branch.
I'm Ella, and I'm at the Laurel branch.
Spooky. Horror. I'm not well versed. This is a pretty new genre to me. I usually read thrillers, but I do love horror movies. So that counts for something, I hope. So let's start with a somewhat easy question. What makes a horror novel horror? And I'm going to swing it to Ella first.
Our expert, our horror expert.
Yeah.
I do read a lot of horror. I would think that really what makes horror is if it's considered scary. And I know that's like a really general thing to say, but there's a lot of overlap with thriller and other like things like that. And there's so many different types of horror. Like, there's serial killers and there's like body horror and there's paranormal horror. So I think just like generally, if it is scary to everyone, not just you, it's probably horror.
I like the definition you gave, Ella. I think you might have given it when we did our thriller program a little while back about the difference between terror and horror. And that helps me kind of think about what horror is. So like terror is the feeling of dread leading up to something terrible happening. And then horror is how you feel after it's happened. And so obviously, a lot of horror novels, especially the ones I was reading in preparation for this, you usually have both. There's like the build up and then the big scary thing, or a lot of scary things along the way. I can think of some examples where some start like the very first page, it's horrible, and it just keeps getting worse. Because of course, like kind of like Alice said, there's always going to be people who think different things are scary. But I think in general, a lot of horror is meant to be scary to pretty much everybody because it tends to hit on themes of what's taboo in society and like plays with that. And so that I think that's the idea, is that if you're playing with like a cultural taboo, you got a good chance of like squicking everybody out.
I read a quote recently when I was talking to a different staff member about horror, and don't ask me what the quote was because I don't remember, but the general gist of it was that there's a certain base level that we all just kind of assume is okay and like within the scope of reality, and horror for either like physical reasons, like something paranormal is happening, or like emotional reasons, like, hey, you're not supposed to eat people. I thought we all agreed that that's not okay. And then you did it anyway. Yeah. So I think like horror takes you outside of things that like most of us have agreed are not okay. And I think, Sarah, you brought up a good point that really kind of pushes the taboos because you're already feeling really uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And then someone is just like really going at, or something is going like really at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, horror like pushes those boundaries, so they make the unimaginable imaginable. Ooh. I was just telling Sarah, in the book I'm reading now, no one has tried to eat anyone yet, so I'm waiting.
Is it a book that you're planning for people to eat people?
Well, the book is called The Hunger by Alma Katsu, and it's a retelling of the Donner Party story with a supernatural twist. So Donner Party equals cannibalism.
Joy's like, come on, like, get to it. Like, I'm waiting for the cannibalism. I think is what draws people to horror in general. It's like going towards something that you might otherwise want to like look away from.
Yeah, that's a really good segue into my next question. Like, what brought you to horror books? So, Sarah, what brought you to horror?
So I have a very personal connection with like horror and spookiness and Halloween because my dad is like the biggest Halloween fan I know. There's always been a room in my parents' house that's been dedicated to all of his Halloween decorations, scary things, latex like body parts for haunted houses. Like that's just been part of something that I've like grown up with my whole life.
That's your life?
Yeah.
I'm so shocked.
Yeah. But now I'm coming back around and learning what type of horror I appreciate. I find that, and I mean, this is a broad generalization because there's all kinds of stuff out there, but a lot of contemporary horror can be very like way too gory for my taste, like way too over the top, like gory and vicious. And I prefer a much like subtler, like type of psychological horror. So I've just started getting into reading a lot of Shirley Jackson, and oh my gosh, like that's what I love. That's the type of horror that I love. Oh, and the other thing I forgot to mention that got me into horror was I was a Goosebumps fanatic as a kid. So yeah.
What is your favorite horror novel that you've read so far? It doesn't have to be like end all be all, but like what's one that you're really into right now? I even have to think about this because I'm gonna pass it to Ella. Well, I wonder.
I think we're all going to say Brother, but I don't know that for sure. I'm going to go with Brother, which we briefly talked to. Okay, perfect. That wasn't your good. Oh, yes. Okay.
Far from it.
Yes. Okay. So Brother is my absolute favorite horror novel to date. As you both know, I recommend it to everyone I've ever met in my life, whether it's they read horror or not. And briefly summarized, it is about an Appalachian family that kills people, which is I feel kind of like not an archetype, a stereotype.
Yeah.
Some type of like, theme.
It's in the like Deliverance vein, kind of.
Yeah, like Deliverance. People out in the woods that are eating people.
Yeah.
It hits literally every taboo.
Yes.
I feel.
Yeah.
That you could ever not want. So it really just is no holds back. But I don't feel like anything is in there that is thrown in there and then never addressed. I feel like the author does a really good job like weaving it all in there. And the ending was so good and so surprising. I cannot believe that someone wrote it, because I've read many books where I'm like, oh, I wish it had ended this way, or I wish I did it. Not only did it have a surprise ending, but it was the best ending that I could have thought of. And it tied together so neatly, and I felt changed afterwards. So it does have a lot of gore, and it does talk a lot about taboos that are very uncomfortable. But if you are willing to look through that, it was a really well written book, and I do recommend it with a lot of warning stickers on it.
Yeah, I will say it like made me sick to my stomach like multiple times, and maybe like one more time than I was comfortable with for a single book. Like maybe one too many like stomach turning moments. But like Ellen and I had talked about, and like you just said, I appreciated the craft of it. Like I think it was, because I have to imagine that good horror is probably some of the hardest stuff to write. And because there's so many ways it can go wrong or go cheesy or corny or so many things, and so many things have been done a million times. So I appreciate the craft of it, but I was just like, that's one of those ones where it's like, all right, I've read that and I'm never gonna read it again.
I also feel like it must be this sounds dumb, but it must be some of the bravest to write, because someone's going to pick up your book and be like, you not only thought this in your head, but put it on paper and then went through the, publishing process.
Yeah.
Like, you made this?
Yeah. I could see that. Like, that's the type of thing where I can imagine, like I wrote it, my parents would be like, you all right? Like,
do you need a therapist?
How's therapy going, sweetie?
Yeah, my Ella describing it, her enthusiasm had the opposite effect. I kind of want to read it again. But yeah, I too really enjoyed that book. It was a lot.
Yeah,
and the titles might be a little misleading too, because if you're like, you should read Brother, then it's like, oh, is it like a nice family tale about like
it's all in the family?
But that's one of the good parts about it, that the title throws you off so much. Like, you start with just family bonds, and that is the farthest thing from what happens in the book.
Yeah,
I'll say I do love the title, because I think it's perfect. It's so clever, because once you read it, there's like a bunch of different meanings of that word in the story. So it's perfectly titled. And like you said, it draws you in, because you look at that and like you would have no idea what to expect with a title like Brother. And that's still how I feel about it. It just makes it go.
But what about you guys? I'm just gonna talk about Brother for an hour, but
I think mine's more of like a combination of like the book and then the film adaptation, which like enhance each other. So like The Shining, I thought was such a good read, and I love the movie. So like having them both in my mind, it like is truly creepy. And like just, imagining just going like slowly going mad. It's just something you never want to happen to you.
I do appreciate The Shining because I always say The Shining is like the first grown-up scary movie I watched.
Mhm.
And it really is scary. It holds up. And I would put like Silence of the Lambs there too, is one that like, no matter how many times I watch it, it's always gonna freak me out.
Cannibalism.
Yeah, right. It all comes back to cannibalism. So I do like The Shining, and I like the whole lore around the adaptation and everything that goes along with it. And it was also the first Stephen King novel I read because I was like kind of a snob, like I'm not even gonna read it. And I did just because I wanted to check it out, and I was like, okay, this is clearly written by somebody who's dealing with his own inner demons here on the page. So yeah, I do appreciate The Shining.
But what's your favorite?
I'd probably say, and I don't know if it's just because it's so fresh in my mind from having read so much of it this week, like very recently, is like I am obsessed with everything Shirley Jackson writes now, in all the ways that we've talked about before, like unreliable narrator, especially when that unreliable narrator is a woman, and how she gets treated when people don't believe her. Like in The Haunting of Hill House, they go to a haunted house for the express purpose of looking for ghosts, and then she sees a ghost and nobody believes her, and they treat her like she's an idiot. And I'm just like, when they're looking for ghosts. And so it's very good. Like it's very good for feminist reading of horror. It's like Shirley Jackson's a good place to start. And some of the best horror and like sci-fi writers have always said that Shirley Jackson she's like the best scary story writer.
I did like the ones that I read leading up to this though. The first one I read is called Little Darlings. And that's, it's a kind of a retelling or an adaptation of what is it called? It's about the folklore of changelings.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's about, the premise is, so it does involve babies and children, which is like kind of scary in itself. But this woman has twins, but then she meets like this swamp scary lady who threatens to switch her twins out with her twins, and it's like the main character is sent to like a mental institution, and like people don't believe her, but then stuff happens where you're like like a mother would definitely know her own children, but it's really good.
Glad you mentioned that, because there's a lot of horror that is almost like off limits in my head, because at this point in my life I can't read anything where like a child gets hurt, and that knocks out a whole lot of horror, honestly, because again, if you're talking about taboos or what people would be the most upset by, that's one of those things that like people are going to universally find upsetting. Yeah, so now that's what I'm trying to find. And whenever somebody recommends horror to me, as you guys know, I'll be, do any kids get hurt in this?
Any kids get hurt?
I feel like I haven't read a ton of horror books that the kids get like actually hurt.
Yeah.
I read books that the kids like disappear. Which actually, now that I'm saying, there are a few books where the kids, even then when the kids get like killed, they usually are still very respectful of like they found the body and not like this is what happened to the kid. But yeah, I can definitely understand that, because I feel like kids are kind of like that. There's, even if you're not a parent, and I imagine it's so much worse when you're a parent, like there's like a deep species need to like protect. So it's always really interesting then on the flip side when the children are the villain, and you're like, I don't know how I feel. So I read a book called Baby Teeth that came out last year, and I think it was like a mix of, the review said it was a mix of Rosemary's Baby and the book We Need to Talk About Kevin. And it basically is the idea, like, what if your child is a sociopath? And in this case, I think the kid is like 6.
Oof.
So on one hand, you're like, there's no possible way. But on the other hand, the book like talks a lot about from the kid's perspective. And you're like, oh, wow. This kid is absolutely not okay.
This kid's not okay.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how, and there'll also be like waves of what's in vogue in horror. So like zombies, you know, when they came on the scene in like the 80s with what was it, with Night of the Living Dead, like the first zombie movie. And so there was a big push for zombies. In the 60s, around the time that you got like Rosemary's Baby.
Then there's The Omen and also The Exorcist.
I'm just picturing like there's this like era in like film and horror of, you know, what if your kid's really a demon? And it's interesting, I think, what that shows about like what people are scared of at the time. I think it's because I also think that a lot of horror is satirical, political, and so it's interesting to see like what are people scared of right now.
So, but yeah, Sarah, you jumped like 5 questions ahead. I was going to ask about the evolution of horror. Ella has a much bigger library of horror. Like, what is your take?
I mean, I feel like Sarah already said it really beautifully. Like, it really does reflect what society is afraid of. And I laughed when she said the zombies of the 80s because, you know, now we've actually even passed the parody stage of that.
Yeah.
You know, Shaun of the Dead and stuff like that, where, you know, zombies were the horror. We actually already hit the parody stage and now we're like past the parody stage. So I'm interested, you know, and we had there was, and I forget what time period it's said to be, but like, you know, like the intruder stereotype of horror. And then they had like the Scream movies and like some other ones where like you break in.
Oh yeah, that's true. I completely forgot about that whole like golden age in the 90s of like Scream, and I Know You Did Last Summer, and
yeah. Like, what if someone broke into your house or you accidentally killed someone? Like,
yeah. Or you get like the whole genre of like somebody creepy is calling you on the phone, which is like
I feel like home
very
invasion
very real.
I feel like home invasion was a big topic of the 90s, you know, and especially like when like late 90s when the internet was like kind of becoming a thing, like, you know, the babysitter calling and being like, "You creepy doll, you know, in your house," and they're like, "We don't have a life-size doll, get out."
Yeah.
You know, like, or like, "Hey, I'm receiving a phone call," or, you know, so just all that kind of like someone is in your house and or someone is coming to your house, very like home invasion.
Yeah. And you can see kind of there just how like technology is introduced as like, you know, a scary thing in and of itself. This proliferation of you know, somebody can reach you in your house. You're not safe in your house because you've got this phone, you've got this way for somebody to get in. And also, you know, 90s, you're talking about home invasions, like that was like the era of the latchkey kid too. So it's like you can always point to these very real things that when you put it through this horror lens, it becomes, you know, was it lots of babysitters getting killed, basically.
But I don't know what horror we're currently in.
I feel like we're in the stage of being afraid of cults.
Of what?
Cults, C-U-L-T.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
A lot more culty things come out.
Yeah.
Like, but I also think
because you had Midsummer.
Yeah, and Hereditary, which is kind of like culty.
Yeah.
Well, with movies. We're going back to movies, but that's all I know.
I feel like the books have been very much like, what if someone you thought you knew really well, you don't actually know really well?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that, sorry.
No, you're fine. I was gonna say, I think it was narrowing in from the time of what if a stranger is watching you to what if your next door neighbor is actually the head of a cult and you didn't know.
I feel like we also cycle through a lot too, you know, of what, because there are so many tropes and themes that stand the test of time. Like, I'm still terrified of intrusion, and I would not want to meet a malicious spirit. One book that I read in the past week or so that is relevant to now, because it's about a contagion, a breakout of a virus. It's called Wilder Girls. And it's about this all girls boarding school, and something called the Tox breaks out, and it's about them surviving and how like the mainland has kind of abandoned them and like how they managed to survive. And it focuses on 3 friends. It is LGBTQ plus, which is like really cool because I feel like you don't see that a lot.
Yeah, I have a lot I want to say about that too.
Yeah. So
yeah, because tying together a couple of my thoughts, because we talked about, what the themes that we cycle through in horror, and how a lot of horror is also, morality tales too. Kind of the cliche one being that, in a slasher movie, the virgin's always safe kind of thing. So there a lot of times there are morality stories, and like Frankenstein is a really good example of that, because it's like, it's spelled out pretty clearly, like, you tried to be like God, you tried to make a person, and that didn't go well. And this is what happens when you try to like pretend to be God and have that kind of power. And so when you talk about like queerness and horror, there's a lot of precedent for that being set up as like a morality tale. You think of like how many villains in horror are presented as queer. So you've got Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, which was really controversial when it came out and is still controversial now. Oh, Psycho. You've got Norman Bates in Psycho.
Right.
And, he's presented this, in that era would have been like, oh, that funny bachelor, type of thing, that he's not quite right, that bachelor who lives, with his dead mom in his house. Anyways, there's a lot of that, and so it's always so refreshing to see, like you said, a horror story where, it's not like a queer person who's the villain, or that's not the scary thing about it.
I've not read Brown Girl. I'm very excited to read it. I'm on the wait list for. Oh, what's the book? I think it's called Plain Bad Heroine.
Oh, plain. Yeah, I'm on the wait list for that as
So
well.
I'm excited for that one to come out too, which is also a queer horror. I've been excited to see them popping up on recommended lists, because they've always been out there, but now they're, I think, getting the time and advertising they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, what I really liked about Wilder Girls, it wasn't like, how Sarah said, how the queer representation in like books and movies have just been like Buffalo Bill, he's a terrible person. And in Wilder Girls, it just was like our protagonist is queer. That's just it.
Yeah.
It wasn't a huge part of what was going wrong in the story, which I really liked. I do want to kind of go back to what Sarah was saying about, when you're reading a book where it takes place in a haunted house, you're like, well, why don't you just, walk out the front door, break a window, but like the house itself is what is, keeping people in. So let's talk about settings or objects that can be characters within the horror novel. So what are your thoughts? And I don't know who to start with.
I'm going to start. I think Sarah has a lot to say, and I don't have as much to say. But one book that immediately comes to mind is Shining Girl. And the house is not haunted, but like kind of haunted. I don't want to give too much away because the book is actually very good. There's killing involved. The house does weird stuff that's involved in the killing. The house actually picks the people to be killed. And the house may or may not have a chapter 2 where it expresses its feelings, which was really weird, but was really interesting. And that author has a few really good horror books that get into like weird topics. Like, what if the haunted house was the one that was doing the killing? And you're like, okay. So,
okay, I'll check it out.
Yeah. So that's just a book that comes to mind. I don't really have any like more thoughts because I don't read a ton of house-related horror. I have seen that there have been a few books I've read recently where the characters will come right out and say that like, we can't afford to move, so this is what we have. So I like that realism. Like, hey,
talk about like a modern political horror,
our mortgage.
Yeah. The bubble burst. But yeah, I think that's that's a very common trope in horror, especially when you talk about like, Gothic novels, which again, Shirley Jackson is very representative of like that Gothic genre where the house is sentient, the house doesn't want you to leave. a lot of where somebody's just out living their life and then they find themselves like drawn to coming to this house. It's like, sort of like you said, the house picks the people. It's like, you've got this draw you can't pull away. It's like somehow you find yourself like, well, I have to go there. And now that I'm here, I can't leave. And, you know, when people talk about, you know, what does it want from me? And they're talking about the house because the house won't leave them alone. I think that's so classic. And of course, you know, the Shining, I would say, is you know, just that on a much larger scale, this, you know, enormous hotel. You've got that element of seclusion, the whole, you know, nobody can hear you scream thing.
Mm-hmm.
I just read White is for Witching, which was a very good book, but in that book, that house is also like a character and can move around as far as like rooms are concerned. So rooms appear and disappear.
Oh yeah.
And depending on where the house wants you is where like things are. And the family is really the only one that even kind of has an idea of that, but even they're not aware. So I think sometimes in addition to the house having a will of its own is also like it's removed from the rules of physics. Like it doesn't have to be a 4-bedroom house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to think of more where the setting is a character, and the house is like the one that the only thing I can think of.
There is like I think a subgenre of cursed objects, but I think for the most part, at least in my reading experience, that has not been such a trope in adult horror books. I think in children's horror books and YA horror books, that seems to be more present. And I think that's because, well, I don't know why that's because, but my theory is because when I read it in children's fiction, it's easier to like remove the cursed object. And so I think with children's books about horror, that's really important because you don't want a child to feel trapped in this horrible setting. And it kind of gives them like, well, yeah, I found this cursed doll, but I'm going to take it to a cliff and throw it off and the curse is like removed. Whereas I think in adult horror, there's a lot more like you are trapped in this situation and you can't get out no matter what. And especially in the case of something following you, like, yeah, you know, I went to this area and it was cursed and now the curse is with me. And I don't feel like you see that too much in children's books about horror.
I was gonna mention something about children's books and why like cursed objects are more prevalent in those genres. And part of me was like, is it to kind of teach them like don't touch things? Shouldn't be touching?
I mean, I'm sure that's like a side lesson.
Yeah, it's just like in traditional nursery rhymes or nursery rhymes, fairy tales. You know, don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you. Don't eat anything. Like if you travel somewhere to a different world, don't eat anything. That's never going to go well for you.
I was gonna say I was really nice, being like, no, we don't want to trap children in horrible settings. But you guys are like, so
Don't touch that.
so let's talk about fairy tales and how scary those are.
Yeah, don't go into strangers' houses or they'll try to eat you.
Yeah, again, there's your morality lesson, you know.
Yeah.
Fairy tale for kids.
It's a different avenue of like teaching them not to do things.
Just scare the bejesus.
By scaring them, it's effective. I mean, it worked on me. I don't like touching things that aren't mine. I won't do it.
Well, it's interesting that we're talking about children's because I know Joy had mentioned this before, and I've done this before, where I've done horror books for children around around Halloween, and I've done scary stories to tell in the dark. And the group that I got at the library when I did it, you know, kids, they walk in and they're like, oh, I'm big and brave. And you're like, let's read this story about someone who saw a disfigured body in the distance. And they're like, I don't want to read this anymore.
Yeah. Still some of the scariest stories I've ever read are scary stories to tell in the dark.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see like what things are in children's books and what aren't. Christina Henry has a few books, and most of them are fairy tale retelling. One of them is Alice, which is about Alice in Wonderland, and another is Lost Boys. And I am 99% sure they're considered horror. I don't know if they're like officially considered horror. They have a lot of horror elements, like what if, and Sarah, you wouldn't like Lost Boys because it's about Peter Pan and he makes them fight to the death. And
Oh no.
yeah, like he basically like every couple of years like go finds more Lost Boys. Like he kidnaps them.
As if
So
the
that's
story
really,
wasn't problematic enough already. Like, now we just like turned into Hunger Games.
well, yeah, so so as soon as they hit puberty, they end up for some reason or another, you know, needing to challenge him and he ends up killing them. And then Alice in Wonderland, I believe they escape from a mental institute.
Mm.
And there's like a whole dark series, but they are both exceptionally graphic.
Ooh.
And there's definitely some Frankenstein's monster stuff going on with some of the characters where like is really clever but is also really graphic. But if you don't mind very graphic things, definitely worth it as far as fairy tale retellings.
Well, do you have a least favorite horror novel?
Yes, I do. I have both a least favorite subgenre of horror and a least favorite horror book.
Okay, go.
My least favorite horror subgenre is paranormal, and I'm so sorry. And the reason that that is my least favorite subgenre of horror is that not all, not some, but like my experience with paranormal horror has been like there's something unexplained and now it explains by a ghost or like a bump in the night. Whereas I feel like non-paranormal horror, like the author really has to like fill those gaps.
Yeah.
Which is why Broken Monsters, which is by the same author as Shining Girls, I really liked because I was expecting a very paranormal thing, and there was some spooky stuff at the end, but someone is making human animal hybrids.
I did read this one.
And yeah, so it turns out, and you're worried that it's just gonna be something spooky, but it turns out like they explain like the materials they're using to put these bodies together, and it's like super arts and craftsy. And I was really worried when I read it that it was just gonna be something spooky happening, but like they talk about like a glue that's like used in leather works. As far as books, I did not like Meddling Kids, which was a retelling-esque of Scooby-Doo.
That still makes me laugh every time.
What?
It makes me laugh every time I hear it. Like a grown-up Scooby.
Meddling Kids.
It was a really good concept, and then the writing. I hope the author is not watching this, but the writing was so bad. It was to me, it was completely unreadable. I had to read it in chunks. And everyone else loved it, and I don't know why. Like some of the concepts are really good. It reminded me of some elements of like the Umbrella Academy, which were like good, where they all kind of had like weird powers and someone was dead. But the writing, like I just didn't understand the metaphors that were being used, and they weren't like scary. So then you had to be like, the blood was like tomato soup. I mean, I guess kind of.
Yeah, now I'm just hungry.
Yeah, like now I just feel weird. Like now I'm just imagining an attic full of tomato soup. Like I'm not.
It's spooky.
Yeah.
Is it a graphic novel or is it a?
It is not. It is actually an adult fiction, and we have it in our collection. And I believe he actually wrote another book, but I'm unfamiliar with the second book.
I think I really like short story horror because my attention span is so small that the slow burn books I tend to get bored and then I stop reading them, even though I know they get better, but I just can't pay attention. So I like short stories a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say for different reasons, I think short story horror is some of my favorite. I think in part just because, like I said, with Brother, it was like one too many stomach churns for me. Like sometimes I feel like it's a lot. It's a lot to process a whole horror book when it's like really, really creepy. So it's like sometimes I prefer something that, it's short. They pack a real punch. Like, scary stories to tell in the dark all fits in that category. Campfire stories. Like, I just love that. Like, I almost want to say formula, that format of, you know, building to this, like, you know, creeptastic thing. Like in the lottery, it's a very normal story until like the last sentence. And and again, just thinking about, again, appreciating like the author's craft, that to me, like, a good scary short story is like a perfect piece of writing.
Yeah, which is what Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark did, because those still stick with me. And I'm doing a read aloud with it. And so I'm going to get scared all over again. And those illustrations.
Yeah. Oh, man.
So there are two collections of short horror stories that I want to recommend if you have not read them already.
Okay.
And one of them is called Diary of a Murder and Other Stories. And I will say that it is a collection of short stories. Let's say the book has 4 short stories. 80% of the book is the first short story, which is the Diary of a Murderer, and then the other ones kind of are shoved in there. So at least that's how I read it. So the short story that the book is named after is, in my opinion, very, very good. I didn't enjoy the other ones as much, but it is about an older gentleman who is a serial killer, but he also has Alzheimer's, so he doesn't know. There's been some new murders, and he does not know if it is him or not, which I feel like is a really unique perspective, because usually the unreliable narrator has something else happening with them, but like he has Alzheimer's or dementia or something of that nature. And the other one I would recommend that is gory, but also I felt from a feminist perspective was really good, was Her Body and Other Parties.
I have that one on hold.
It's really, really good. Some of them are a little gory, but I thought that they did a really good job. For example, one of the stories was a retelling of the woman with the ribbon around her neck.
Oh, yes. I am reading that. That's why it sounds familiar. I just finished reading that. Yes. Yeah, because I remember thinking, as soon as she talked about the ribbon around her neck, I was like, oh, this evokes a lot of familiar, like, horror imagery for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and just like the exploration of, like, I know for that story, spoiler, if I'm remembering correctly, like, I think the ribbon was supposed to be a stand-in for either trauma or secrets, or like, body anatomy, body autonomy.
Yeah,
and different women in the story had different ribbons, different places. And so it's like a really interesting exploration, and all the stories are basically like that. So that one is really, really good. I would recommend.
Okay, so let's talk about authors that are POCs and or LGBTQ+. Ella, you said a really good thing about diverse horror, didn't you?
Yeah, so to our viewers, I sent my coworkers a article that was actually on our database called Novelist, which is a book recommendation database that we have in Prince George's County. And they will sometimes have articles on there. And there was a really good article about diverse horror reading. And it was linked as well to a really good article that was basically like, the article is called something like, the only thing scary is the racism in here. So there was a really good talk about some other books that were more diverse. So we can drop that in the chat, I'm sure. Also, I will say some of the ones that are on my list, I got through Marina, which is a great service, obviously, but if you want to read them quickly, it's probably not the greatest service right now.
Ella, what is Marina? How does it work?
So good question, Joy. Thank you so much for asking. So as you may or may not be aware, Prince George's County shares a collection throughout all of our branches. So we know 2 branches have the same collection. We tend to have collections based on our local communities. But that means that since we're all friends, if someone at my branch wants a book that's at Joy's branch, I can be like, hey, Joy, send me the book. And it's usually at my branch in 2 to 3 days for pickup. So we have a really big collection, but sometimes, you know, we don't have stuff for whatever reason. And then we turn to Marina, and Marina is a group thing. Marina is a group service for other libraries in Maryland. And so if we don't have a book, we can we can look through the Marina service and see if another library has it. So for example, say like Howard County has it. We can request them to send it to us, and they will send it through their administration, through our administration, and then it will go to the branch. So it takes a little bit longer, but you don't have to drive to that location, and you also don't have to be a member of another library. It's never a bad thing to be a member of multiple library systems, but especially now when you're trying to cut down on travel, it's probably best not to be driving all around the state, which is really good. I tend to use it actually a lot for really specific horror. I actually do use it a lot for my horror books because I like to read a lot of books that there aren't that many print copies left. Either they don't do a lot of reprinting, and there's some collections in Maryland that have wider archives than we do. We tend to not archive as aggressively as some other libraries, which is great because our collection's in really good shape. So if there's like a book that came out in the 60s that I want, and it hasn't been reprinted, I'll usually get that from Marina. That's been really nice because then I don't have to buy it.
Yeah, a whole other way to get even more library books.
Yeah, and we love sharing, and we send a ton of stuff out.
Yes, we do. This is taking a hard right turn because just as I was like looking at some more lists, I realized there's a whole subgenre we haven't talked about, and maybe just because we're still in the parody stage for it, and that's vampire stories. I think we're very much still in vampire parody world, but like traditional vampire stories, like spooky and sexy. So, you know.
I was just gonna add in, like, do you think has there been a portrayal of Dracula as queer? Because he's so like
I'm sure.
and seduces everyone.
I'm sure there is.
You'll find things like, so I guess BBC did a Dracula earlier in the year. So the headline is BBC's Dracula gay or very gay? And here's, where was it said, Dracula's greatest triumph, the vampire as a queer liberator. So yeah, I don't know enough about the Dracula story in particular, or, you know, I don't read a lot of vampire novels in general to speak to that, but now there's a lot I want to read about.
I invite every single viewer to roast us super hard and in the comments for not being versed on this, because we have let you down as librarians for not having this readily available.
Yeah, so, I got work to do. I got my work cut out for me here.
If you are immediately thinking of several queer, maybe specifically Dracula, but maybe not specifically Dracula, novels or graphic novels or movies, anything that you think that we should know about, please tell us. We're dying to know.
Anything.
And the graphic novel that I was talking about is called Moonstruck.
Ooh.
And it is, again, very beautifully, and I was right, one of the werewolf ladies is Black, and they are both, well, not both. It's very body positive. I feel like one of them is on the larger side, which is nice to see, because I feel like, you know, there's something that is, and we've talked about this, I feel like, in other discussions, but there's something that is inherently linked between thinness and sexiness, and I think relationships as well. So it's really nice to see like all kinds of body types in this one. I've really liked, and I am ashamed / proud to say I know more about feminist horror than I do, I think, about queer representation horror. But I do feel like there has been a retaking of horror, specifically related to women and women identifying people. And that has been great, because I don't need another story about a man.
Yeah.
Definitely not. I don't like werewolves because of the T word.
The what?
The T word. The author, Stephanie Meyer, wrote a book.
Oh, that T word. I was like, transfiguration.
No.
I thought it was top serum.
Oh, no. Twilight.
It's actually really funny that you bring that book up because when I was a teenager at my local library, I got Twilight from my local library, and I'm going to say the story. And I read it not as a vampire scary book, but as a romance book.
Mhm.
And there have been a few articles that have come out, well, not recently, because Twilight's old news, no offense to Stephanie Myers, but just about how, Bella is this blank slate,
Mhm.
and Edward is this, I'll love you no matter what. And so you can like really imagine yourself in that relationship. And I thought those articles were really interesting. Because even if you're not interesting and you talk really slow and you live in the middle of nowhere, there's a partner out there that will just
There's
real-
somebody for everybody.
there's someone for everybody.
Mhm.
I have a question.
Yeah.
That I actually don't know the answer to, so I'm interested in your discussion. Why do you think vampires are considered so sexy?
I think, why are they considered sexy?
And aside, so question 2/question A underneath of the original question is, do you think that vampires are considered sexier in films than they are in books? Because I feel like all the vampire books I've read are like, and then he came into my village and like killed everyone but me, and he turned me, and now I'm stuck as a vampire. But all the movies are like, he sexually sexted into my room.
I think some of it is just like the physicality of it, I guess, of just like
Yeah.
what
Well,
it is to like transform somebody, into a vampire. I remember as a kid, I remember channel surfing, and I came across like there was some old vampire movie on, and it was like at the moment where she was being turned. And I remember thinking, because I was a little kid, I was like, there's something here I should not be watching. Like I picked up on this feeling of like,
so
it's
inappropriate.
not for me. And so I changed the channel real fast. So it's like, even then it's like I could pick up on like, it was very, very sensual.
Well, one of the first vampires is Nosferatu, and he's not sexy.
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask.
Sarah?
We are not going to judge anyone here.
I mean, each to their own. That's true, but I don't think Nosferatu was like. I haven't seen the movie myself, but I don't think he was seducing people.
No, I wonder where the lore of this is another topic of lore, which I would love to discuss further with you guys. But I feel like my first vampire book was Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, which is, I feel like, a staple. And that book is.
I wonder if she kind of, she had a big part in it becoming sexy too. Because I mean, she's a sexy writer. I can't think of the word for it. She writes a lot of erotica, so it was.
So maybe she contributed to that. Like,
Yeah.
I do see how like Dracula and vampires can be sexy because they're like mysterious. Like they don't go out during the day very much.
It's very bodice rippy too. Like the whole, like the vibe, the aesthetic, and like what the woman's always wearing. It's very like feminine and bodice rippy.
Yeah. So what?
I was just gonna say, I wonder how horror got to have this weird subgenre of horror sexy. Because I feel like, even when we talked about earlier about archetypes, like there is always, potentially a virgin, and that really in theory should not have any weight on what order you're killed in, but seems to. So I wonder.
I have an interesting theory that I'm building in my head right now as we speak, that there's a lot of overlap between like sexiness and horror, because I think you're talking about situations where you're very vulnerable. And so, I think that's like a real shared thing between the two, of that feeling of like vulnerability and not being protected. So
fear and adrenaline, and Dracula's not biting your arm, he's biting your neck. So like that's central.
And like that, I wonder if like there's that feeling of, and then because they're trying to like freak you out, it's like you're confusing one type of thrill for another type of thrill, and all just kind of gets.
There's adrenaline going. I don't know why. This developed into something weird later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think vulnerable is a good point. Because the other thing about horror is usually like you're alone, you're maybe in somewhere you're not familiar with. There's the very famous shower scene, and you don't really get more vulnerable than that. So I think that's. I do think there is a level of vulnerability that's important in horror. So like some of the other books that are on my list to recommend, Baby Teeth, which I talked about before, which is the child is the villain.
Mhm.
And in theory, there's nothing more vulnerable than children, but the child in this case is the villain.
Yeah.
We need to talk about Kevin, obviously. Brother, family is very important. There is actually a book that I really like, and it is a translated book, so English is not the language that it was originally written in. And I think about it, it lives rent free in my head. It is called Perfume, the Story of a Murderer.
Oh.
And it is top 5 most interesting books I've ever read. And I believe I got it through our Overdrive. So it's not a physical book, it was on our Overdrive, but
Yeah.
it is about a young man whose nose is so good, he can smell like very subtle differences. Like he can smell people's, pheromones, he can smell things that are miles and miles away. So he has like a super delicate smell palette or sense. And he works, I believe, for a perfumist. And this is not a period piece, but it's not like written current times. And I believe he hunts someone down by their smell because he believes he will never smell it again. And he's so consumed by the thought. So he goes through the city, I believe he's in London, but he hunts through the city to find this, and he finds out the smell is like a woman. And he's concerned that he will just never smell it again.
Whoa.
And I think sounds really weird, but I think smell is a sense that is not often used in horror, which is why the way it's written about him smelling things is like really interesting.
And I'm surprised it's not when scent is like such a primal sense. They talk about how it's so tied to memory.
And I agree. I think that smell isn't really explored a lot, especially, they always say like, I can smell your fear, so in theory, like smell is related to horror, but it's usually much more common with either visual, like Bird Box, where
I still haven't seen. I still haven't seen it.
I read
the person on the planet Earth who has not seen it.
I read the book a year before I saw it. So I read the book, was like, this was not a great book. I didn't like it. And then I saw the movie, and I was like, fine, it can stay. So it is definitely one of those ones where I feel like the film did it justice that the book did not do.
So that brings me to my last kind of like, if someone is brand new to horror, what would you recommend for them? I haven't read enough to have a go-to, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in the same boat. I don't know if I could. I wouldn't even know where to start. There's so much.
It really depends, I think, on the type of horror that they're interested in. As you know, there are many sub-genres of horror, some of which there is definitely child/motherhood horror. So like Rosemary's Baby, Baby Teeth, We Need to Talk About Kevin, Little Darlings, just anything involving children. There's body horror, like Broken Monsters, where like the actual body's involved. Serial killers make their own debut. Diary of a Murder was on there, and then Perfume is also a serial killer book. There's just straight up gore, which is usually when body parts are everywhere. Something like Monsters, where there's monsters involved. But I would say there's a young adult horror that I actually would recommend, and it's called I'm Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells. And it's a YA book, so it is, I think, very inviting, regardless of the age level that's reading it. And it does a really good job of mixing something realistic, like someone has serial killer tendencies, and also there's a fantastical part to it. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And it is a series. I have not read the other books, but I read the first book and it was very good. And it is written from a teen perspective, which I enjoyed. So. But I think any of the classics, you can't go wrong.
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to do. Like, I've been trying to go back. I'm like, okay, I need the like basic education. I need to actually read all of Frankenstein. I want to read all of Dracula. Like, I need to start from, um, and maybe that's wrong of me to say that's the beginning because horror's been around forever. But when you talk at least about like the Western canon, so I don't know if this is just my own bias showing, but I guess I feel like if we want to talk about like how would you narrow down like what you would recommend somebody for the first time, I'd have to ask like how much blood are you okay with? Like, you want no blood or can you do all the blood? And we need to make like a taxonomy of horror, and I feel like blood would be like that'd be my first category.
I think I would start with like, what are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's really important, both with blood, but also like other, and we talked about Brother has a lot of taboos that just people aren't comfortable with. And that's very fair. Also, I want to take this moment to publicly announce that I don't like the book or the movie It, specifically the book. The movie is okay.
I have no interest in it because the book is like this big and I just don't have that kind of time. Also, like, clowns don't really do it for me. I know some people were like, clown is like the top of their list of like what's the scariest thing in the world. Yeah, I don't have time for it.
I publicly invite Stephen King to come fight me. I have never enjoyed any of his books. I respect him as a writer. I will see if I respect him as a fighter. But his books are so long. Every one thing has a background story, and it's just so much writing. And is it necessary? I mean, no, but I have to get through this to get to the part I want. So I don't like being held captive. So
Yeah, I also like, because in this process, like I'm very new to the genre. So I used Goodreads a lot and Novelist a lot to find kind of what to read, like this is what you should read. And I'm like, okay. And then like read the descriptions and then choose from there. And I know I like suspense and I like, thrillers and I like, I don't know, twists and stuff. So that's kind of how I did it.
We also have Next Reads on our website, which you can sign up for, and they will send you book recommendations. And one of the choices is horror. So if you do not feel like contacting any of us, which is fine, you can go on our website and sign up for horror recommendations. And those are selected by a staff member at PGCMLS. So it is not a generated list. Someone in our system does go through and make sure we have those titles in our system. So you're not going to click on something and then realize we don't have it.
Yeah.
Someone does go through and edit, and they are in our system. So
yes,
highly recommend. I get that newsletter to my email, and I go through and put everything on hold, and then forget to read it. And then let the hold expire.
So my very last question is, what is on your reading list? What are you going to read next, or what are you excited to read that's on hold or something?
I started to, when I said I wanted to go back and like read some of the classics, I started to listen to Frankenstein as an audiobook because I have a lot of time in the car right now commuting. I might just have to go back and read it on paper. That's a hard one to follow in audio just because it's a lot, and I find myself like getting distracted by what's on the road and everything. So I'm not a good audiobook listener. But yeah, I think I want to go back and like get a good classic horror education.
I just put I put a book called Mexican Gothic on hold, which I've heard really good things
I have
about.
really good things about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's by Silvia Moreno Garcia.
I have also heard that Mexican Gothic is really, really good. So that is on my list of things to read. I have Plain Bad Heroine on my list of books that are on hold. But all of our copies are checked out, so I'm still on hold, but I am very excited about that one.
Also, there's a horror book about like a haunted IKEA-like place.
I've seen that.
It's called A Horror Store. That's waiting for me at the library, so I'm excited to like see how that rolls out. Because I love IKEA. I could live there, but not if it's haunted. That is by Grady Hendrix.
Another book that I want to plug that I really enjoy, the illustrator, is Emily Carroll is the illustrator / writer, and the book is called When I Arrived at the Castle. And even if you do not read her books, her comics are very dark, but are beautiful. So highly recommend.
Well, I would like to thank you both for joining me today. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Make sure to visit our website to keep up. What?
He's still chilling back there.
I like the one arm. Be sure to check our website for all the virtual events that are happening in our system, and we will see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.